Hello and welcome back to our weekly evening chats. Once again, I am joined by Justin Lee this week, and he is JL Fit on social media if you want to check him out. He is a trainer, so he is way more of an expert on the fitness and exercise side, where I'm more of an expert on the nutrition side. And we've been chatting. Last week, we talked about getting ready for a 5K and what that might look like. So we've been helping out with the Give and Gobble 5K that's coming up in just a few weeks. This week, I wanted to do a different part of exercise, thinking about strength training. And we don't really associate strength training with getting ready for something like a race, but we will definitely discuss if that can be beneficial in getting ready for something like a race. And then also, I want to talk about the number one complaint that I know I get when I encourage people to strength train, and I think you probably see this too, Justin, is I just don't have the time. I just don't have the time. I don't have time to work in that exercise and envision having to go to the gym for hours and hours and spending a lot of time there. And honestly, I don't know who has the time to spend that much unless that is their career. But we wanted to bring a study to you that can show even if you don't have a lot of time, it can be very beneficial. So this study, and actually, sorry, it's not a study, it's a review article. So basically the authors took multiple studies. So they took a review of the literature, everything that was out there, and compiled it into what they felt were their opinions of the research that's out there. So it kind of gives you a good snapshot of the science as we know it kind of thing. Would you say that's about accurate?
Absolutely. Yes, Amanda. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So this article is called No Time to Lift, Designing Time Efficiency Training Programs for Strength and Hypertrophy, a narrative review. So that narrative review is the review of the science as we know it. This was put out in 2021, so it's a fairly recent article in the Journal of Sports Medicine, which is a well-known journal for people who are in sports medicine field. So before we get going, Justin, is there anything that we should consider before embarking on an exercise program or strength training program? Just anything we need to consider or highlight?
Absolutely. You always want to be aware of what your goals are and stay focused on the goals. But it's also important to be aware of, strangely enough, are you healthy enough to improve your health? There's something in the exercise science industry called the big three, and those are diseases in the categories of the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, and the metabolic system. So it's imperative that if you have any of these health-related issues, or even think that you have them, that you go and visit your doctor or your primary healthcare provider and make sure that you are currently approved to participate in an exercise program.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. 100% agree with that. Sometimes we have to work on getting healthier before you can really jump into exercising, where they may have restrictions on you because of your health, and your trainer or you need to know about that before you jump into that program.
Yes. Yes.
As I mentioned, this article is about time efficiency training programs for strength and hypertrophy. Can you kind of explain the difference between, when we're thinking of strength and hypertrophy? Some people may think they go together, but they don't always go together. So what is the difference between those?
Yeah, sure. Strength is basically relative to one's status quo. It's how much muscular force can you generate for a given resistance.
Mm-hmm.
It's measured on what's called the repetition maximum. So in the case of pure strength, a 1 repetition maximum is how much muscular force a person can apply to a given resistance such that they can perform 1 rep, typically, hopefully safely, after which an additional rep is not possible without sufficient rest, of course.
Okay.
And typically, training for strength involves in the 1 rep to 6 rep range.
Mm-hmm.
Hypertrophy, in the strictest sense, or I say the most general sense, applies to a bodily tissue growing larger.
Mm-hmm.
So in the context of exercise, hypertrophy applies to a muscle getting larger through training. And that's typically achieved on a slightly higher rep range, typically on the 8 to 12 repetition maximum range.
Mm-hmm. But
So
Strength and big muscles don't always go together.
That's right. That's right. They're sort of like siblings
Mhm.
in that a person who doesn't look that muscular can be quite strong, whereas also a person who might look strong because they have a lot of muscles are not necessarily that strong.
Mhm.
And of course, there are outliers, but that's typically what happens there.
Absolutely. So, you'd mentioned about the importance of screening for health before entering a program, but does strength training, is the purpose just to make you stronger, have bigger muscles, or can strength training also improve your heart health, your cardiometabolic health, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it can absolutely help under the right conditions. Strength training is really going to put a big stress on your nervous and muscular systems and even the respiratory system to a certain degree.
Mhm.
So that's really going to stress the heart and therefore can achieve a training effect and make you healthier. So, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And then, on the other side of things, when I'm thinking of from my side, our two biggest organ groups are our skin and our muscles. And so
Mhm.
insulin resistance or that pre-diabetes step, I think actually starts in the muscle and when we don't use our muscles. And so if we're getting cleaner about our muscles, we're making ourselves more sensitive to insulin, which in the long run helps. So yes, it can help your heart health and your metabolism basically and how well you burn body fat. So
Absolutely.
yeah. All right. So let's walk through kind of the sections of this paper and tell me your takeaways kind of from each section. We don't want to bog people down with a lot of big information, but I want to give them the highlights of each one of these sections. Okay. So first of all, I should mention that this paper is specifically designed for the untrained person who is not in a heavy duty lifting program to start with. So it is the people like me out there who don't have a lot of time and really don't necessarily enjoy lifting that much, but know that it's important. So it's specifically designed for that person, not the person who is an avid athlete and has been in the gym for hours and for a long amount of time. So the first section, actually, I'm going to open up my study here to look at it. Let's talk about training frequency and volume. And when you're thinking of training frequency and volume, what was your biggest takeaway from this part of the paper?
They're both typically measured over the span of about a week. Frequency applies to how often you're training, let's say, a given muscle group across during a week's time, and
Mm-hmm.
volume is typically the same. It's how much work is that muscle doing, and that's typically a product of how many sets or reps and then the load used.
Mm-hmm.
The study alludes to one weekly set can be about as effective as, or excuse me, one session per
Mm-hmm.
week is about as effective as multiple sessions per week, given that volume is equated. So that
Okay.
might mean performing biceps curls for 4 sets once a week can be equated to training about, you know, 4 sets over a week, let's say 3 sessions, as long as you're also doing about 4 sets across those 3 sessions. And that can translate both to strength and hypertrophy, if those are your goal.
Yeah, but maybe the untrained person, if their goal is hypertrophy, I'd assume that this may not end up applying to them in the long run, but in the beginning, essentially going from not training to training one session a week gives you benefit.
Yes. Anybody who's new, they can probably, just think back on this, or you have this to look forward to. You can make advancements pretty rapidly. And that comes down to improvements in strength, which
Mm,
is the communication between the nervous system and the muscles. Your body is becoming more efficient at producing force, but
yeah.
that will taper off, during which you need to adjust your training by manipulating some variables.
Yeah, and
But
I would assume the
yeah,
goals would be changing at that point too, potentially. So once you get into it
right.
and start seeing your body change, your goals may be changing along the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. That's why you just want to be clear about your goals and why you're showing up to exercise.
absolutely. All right, so the next section is on training load and repetition. So explain what the load and repetitions is and your biggest takeaway from the study here.
Okay, that kind of goes back to the repetition maximum that I mentioned. Typically, when someone's training for strength, you want to train with resistance that will allow you to fail in about the 1 to 6 rep range. Failure meaning you can no longer produce
Can't do it.
force to safely and with good form counteract the resistance with your own body.
Mhm.
Um, and then for hypertrophy, you would want to stick more in moderate rep range, probably more like the more 8 to 12 rep range.
Okay.
And then for endurance, you want to stick to slightly higher than that, maybe the 12 to 15 rep range, and sometimes beyond is also can be a good stimulus for stimulating an endurance capacity response.
Okay. Very good. And then exercise selection. And I liked this part of the study. I liked this part because it broke it down into different, I guess, aspects of exercise selection. And I don't know, I really liked it. So the first one it talked about was focusing on multiple joints versus single joints. Do you want to highlight anything there?
Sure. It's recommended, especially if you're short on time, to focus on multi-joint
Mhm.
exercises as opposed to single joint exercises.
Mhm.
So, for example, a quick one, the biceps, I could just do a biceps curl, and you can see where my upper arm is stationary, and I'm just doing this with my
Yeah,
arm. That's a
you're
single
just
joint, meaning I'm only using
targeting
my
that.
elbow, compared to, say, a lat pull down or a chin up, where I'm using multiple joints. I'm using my shoulder and then my elbows, where I'm either pulling myself up to the bar in the case of pull up, or I'm pulling the bar down to me in the case of a lat pull down with a cable.
Okay. So is that like, would that be also be called a compound exercise where you're hitting multiple muscles all at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. So
Yes.
multi-joint compound, pretty much the same thing in
Yes.
this
So when
context.
I hear those words and think of that, I think of immediately time saver because I can do one exercise that gets a whole bunch of things as opposed to one exercise that does one thing and then I got to move to the next thing and that kind of thing.
Yes, it's very efficient because you're hitting multiple joints at once, therefore they're getting a stimulus all at once.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know that this was in the study and I may be catching you off guard. Hopefully not because you're pretty smart at this kind of thing. But so if you're going for hypertrophy, would your single joint exercise get more hypertrophy than your compound, or are you going to get hypertrophy either way?
Typically, yes, the single joint will promote more gains in the hypertrophy category, but the compound or multi-joint exercises will tend to promote more strength. So again, if you're pressed for time, but you want the hypertrophy goals, maybe spend a little more time on the single joint isolation. But if you're looking for more gains and more bang for your buck, you might say you want to go with the compound moves.
Okay, awesome. All right. And free weights versus machines. So free weights, I think dumbbells, and machines, I think like going to a gym that has like the cables and the lifts and things. I guess you could have those at home as well. But
Mhm.
was there a difference between free weights and machine when it comes to training timing and keeping it short and sweet?
Yes, absolutely. They're both excellent in an exercise program. They have pros and cons each, but in terms of variability, it's good to do both. The recommendation is to do free weights because they tend to better mimic activities of daily living.
Hmm.
They rely more on stabilizers,
Hmm.
so you might not be able to use as much weight relative to a machine.
Hmm.
But in that respect, because there's not as much reliance on stabilizing muscles, you're able to move a bit more weight. So some people might love that idea.
Yeah. If someone is not working with a partner or a trainer, would free weights have a higher risk of injury versus the machines?
Absolutely. There's there's relative to each other, there's not much risk in using a machine.
Hmm.
Free weights, yes. Some with dumbbells where you've got a weight in each hand, more so with barbells. You're basically in many cases pinned beneath a barbell if something goes wrong. So if you
Yeah.
don't have a trainer, someone with you, or a spotter, you definitely want to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And then bilateral versus unilateral exercises. So unilateral, you're just doing that one bicep at the time. The bilateral, you're doing two. I would
Mhm.
think bilateral automatically would save you more time, but is there a difference in the outcome from you doing one
Ye-
side versus two sides?
Yes, both are variables that have great application in an exercise program. The recommendation, especially for time saving, is to do bilateral in the case of the biceps, both arms at once. Not mentioned in the study, but good to know, is that if you train, this won't work if you're short on time, but if you train one arm at a time, you're
Mhm.
actually a bit stronger than if you did both arms at the same time. So
Yeah.
interesting physiological tip.
I could see that because just thinking through the exercises, you're way more focused on that muscle and making sure your form is correct versus when I'm doing both sides, one might slip a little bit if, I'm not necessarily focused on that one muscle as much. So I could definitely see that.
Yeah.
All right. What does the study say about elastic resistance bands?
They're fantastic because they're lightweight. They don't take up a lot of space. Therefore, it's great for portability. They're
Mhm.
not really that expensive. And you typically can just stretch your way to stretch the band to any particular amount of resistance along that repetition maximum curve that you want.
Yeah.
If you
And you
don't
can
want
still
to
take it to
stretch it too
failure.
much, it's a bit of a lower rep or a higher rep, lower resistance workout you can do.
Yeah. Awesome. And then the last one in this section is body weight exercises. Now, I think push ups and squats, but I'm sure there's way more body weight exercises than push ups and squats. But what does the study say about body weight exercises?
Body weight is good. The trade-off is that some things like push-ups are there's not a whole lot of manipulation you can do. If
Mm-hmm.
you do the full push-ups where you're in the plank position, that can be too difficult for your current fitness level.
Mm-hmm.
You can also do a modification where you perform them on your knees rather than your feet, and that makes it easier. But there's like pretty much no in between. So in some cases, doing them on your knees might be too easy, but doing them on your feet or your toes is too difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas squats, it can be, just effective, either way, as an
Yeah.
example.
One thing I love about body weight exercises is it travels well. So no matter where you go, you can do some body weight exercises. So it removes yet another excuse that I often get. Well, I can't get to the gym. Well, you can't get to the gym. There's something we can do. And like you
Right.
established earlier, the study clearly points out that doing something is much better than doing nothing at all. Right
Yes.
there.
10
All right.
minutes of walking is better than watching Friends on Netflix.
Exactly. Exactly. And probably even better for your stress, not even for your, you know,
Yeah.
it's better for all
Yeah.
kinds of things and your sleep. So it improves every part of your life and not just your muscles.
Mhm.
So the next part is repetition velocity. So I'm assuming that is how fast you do each rep and whether or not you're moving rapidly through or you're moving very, very slowly. So anything we need to point out in that part?
Typically if you're going for strength, you want to do a relatively shorter rep.
Mhm.
So you want to try to apply muscular force about as rapidly as you can and do so safely with good form,
Mhm.
and then lower that resistance just about twice as long. So say you try to get in the case of a biceps curl, get the dumbbell or the barbell up in about a second or two,
Mhm.
and then lower it down about a little bit longer than it took you to raise it. So say it took 2 seconds to raise it up, 3-4 seconds or so on the way down. For hypertrophy, you'd want to do a little bit longer.
Mhm.
So not only are you doing a slightly higher rep range for hypertrophy, but also you want your rep velocity or your rep tempo to be a bit longer.
Gotcha. And then what about rest periods? So, doing an exercise and then stopping is, I guess, if you're working a single muscle group or even you can't do a rep and then immediately go back into another set of reps. Your muscle's already been to failure, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Rest typically the more difficult something is, or the closer to your one repetition maximum is, or
Mhm.
the lesser amount of reps that you're doing,
Mhm.
you'll want to take a longer rest period. So the general recommendation for strength training with lower reps is anywhere between 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes on the
Okay.
higher end. Hypertrophy with a slightly higher rep range, you can get away with doing 1 to 2 minutes of rest in between sets. And then for endurance, it can be as low as 30 to 60 seconds. For
Okay.
someone who's just starting in training for strength, you can probably get away with a 1 to 2 second rest period. So there's
Gotcha.
always a benefit to either being someone who's new or someone who's been doing it for longer.
Yeah. Would there be a benefit, or could you even say do an upper body exercise and then go into a lower body, do a rep of that, and then go back to the upper? So you're switching muscle groups. Does that still rest, say, the upper body when you move to the lower, or is it important to completely rest like the whole body?
It will rest the upper body, absolutely. And that's kind of like circuit training, or that's a way to squeeze more work into about the same amount of time.
Uh,
So, for example, you could perform a set of biceps curls, and rather than waiting, say, we'll just say 2 minutes before you do your next biceps curl,
mhm,
you could take that rest period while the biceps are resting and throw in, a squat, for
mhm,
example.
mhm.
So the biceps are resting, the lower half is getting worked, and then you switch it off and back and forth. It's a good way to do more in a shorter period of time.
Yeah, yeah. So the next part of the study is talking about advanced time-saving training methods. And instead of listing off all of these, well, I'm going to list them off, but I'm not going to go through each of them with you. So there was the superset training, the drop set training, and the rest pause training. Do you feel like either of those three are more beneficial than the other? So there was the superset, the drop set training, and the rest pause training. And
Mhm.
honestly, I don't even know what a superset is, so I'm a little clueless there.
Okay. A superset is just basically throwing two different exercises back to back with no
Okay.
rest.
Is that
So
kind of
that
like we
could
were just
be,
talking about?
yeah. So it
Okay.
could be done on one muscle group or done on differing muscle groups. So in the previous example of the biceps curls and the squats, that's an example. It's a good way to
Okay.
save time. And so for that reason, it's great. Drop sets are when you perform, it's like doing smaller sets with a small amount of rest in between. So
Hmm.
let's say instead of doing 10 reps of biceps curls, which I know I'd fail, I might stop at 7 or 8. And rather than taking the 1 to 2 minutes of rest, I'll just rest for, say, 20 seconds and then do another set of 7 or 8. There's some iffy research on that. It's a bit controversial in terms of how well that works for something like hypertrophy. It's not necessarily good for strength, though.
Okay.
And then
The rest
the
pause.
yeah. Did I say drop sets there or rest pause?
I thought I said drop sets, but I could be off too. It's been a day.
Okay, well, the sorry,
You're
the
fine.
situation I described was the rest pause.
Okay.
Um, but drop sets are you take a given resistance, you do it to failure, in which you can
Okay.
no longer move the weights with a solid rep,
Okay.
and then you take off a certain percentage of that resistance, or you just grab a lighter set of dumbbells and you go on and
Ah,
continue until you reach your next point of failure. And then if
gotcha.
you
So you
want, you
just
can do another drop set.
okay. And do they all work equally? It's just kind of personal choice kind of thing?
I would say so. They're all better suited for something more like hypertrophy than strength.
Mm.
I've done all of them, um, and so they all work really well. So it's a
Okay.
good tool to have in
Things different.
your toolbox.
Gotcha.
Just have to try them out and see what works for you, and probably you'll like them more for certain muscle groups or exercises than others.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next part of the study I liked as well because it made me think of times like vacation or illness when you're not exercising, when you're thinking about maintenance of your strength or your muscle mass. Um, how quickly do we start to see decline in either of those from pauses in exercise? And then I guess what do we need to really be focusing on to maintain our muscle mass and things once we get it kind of built up?
Typically, the routine you have done to build up your strength and hypertrophy will continue to serve you down the road.
Hmm.
According to the paper, about 3 weeks is about the time period of no activity where you will start to experience muscular atrophy, where it's
Hmm.
getting smaller and you will lose your gains in your muscular strength.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can say I've seen that, especially when somebody has like COVID or a pneumonia or something like that, and it takes them out because you literally don't have the energy to hardly do anything in those conditions, that you will quickly burn through your muscle mass. Plus, I find that when people are doing a routine and then they stop doing the routine, they often their nutrition suffers at the same time. And when both of those suffer together, it's like they flourish together and they suffer together, don't they? For a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. I've been there. My shoulders hurt. I can't work out, so
Uh-huh.
I'm just going to eat extra. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
a coping
100%.
mechanism, I guess.
So, warm ups and stretching, are they necessary? Do we have to do them? What do you think, and what does the study say?
The studies say if you choose to warm up, which I do recommend,
Mhm.
you want it to be specific. So if you're planning on doing squats, you probably should not be spending your time doing 10 minutes of walking to get your body warm and get your heart rate up. You should be doing squats with a lighter resistance and higher reps, kind of doing 1, 2, or 3 just to work up to the what's called the working set resistance that you're planning on doing to get your results for hypertrophy or strength.
Okay.
Um, and then stretching, it's good for mobility.
Hmm.
You don't necessarily need to do it beforehand unless something maybe feels a little bit tight. And
Hmm.
even if you do it, it should just be not never quick. You don't want to like say bounce or pull a joint, stretch it too
Hmm.
much. Just a gentle lengthening of the muscle and then hold it for a second or two. It's been shown that static stretching actually reduces strength in the short term. So
Hmm.
that's something you probably want to avoid when you're getting in an exercise program.
Yeah.
Stretching after is typically the best time to do it if you choose to stretch.
Yeah, and my husband was talking about a study. He's a basketball coach at Creekwood, and he was talking about a study that was done on basketball players that stretched before the game and looking at their ability to jump and how high it was and how it actually could decrease their performance if they overly stretched their muscles or even sometimes stretching did that. It's like, oh, wow. Which made me
Yeah.
think then too, how much do we need to stretch before we go for runs? But we'll get to that down here in a minute. So let's finish up with the strength training. Give me kind of your overall synopsis, takeaways from this study, how we can practically apply it for those of us that don't have a ton of time. What would your recommendations be?
Uh, per session, as long as nothing is sore, I don't ever recommend training a muscle if it's sore.
Mm-hmm.
Do a minimum of one lower body exercise, for example, like a squat, one upper body pulling motion, like a chin up, pull up, or a cable pull down, and then one upper body pushing exercise, like a push up or a bench press or an overhead press. Typically, stick to reps in about the 6 to 15 range, and about 4 sets a week is probably the sweet spot for you.
Yeah. And something is better than nothing.
Indeed. Indeed. Something is almost always better than nothing.
Yes, yes. All right, so let's circle back around to this idea of the 5K since we're kind of focusing on the Give and Gobble that's coming up. Can strength training or resistance training or lifting, any of the above, be beneficial for someone who is looking to perform in, say, a 5K or any other race to that extent?
Absolutely. You're going to be on your feet, so you'll want your calves, the big muscles on the back of your lower legs. They need to be conditioned and strong. You want your hamstrings and your quads, which are the muscles on the back and fronts of your thighs, respectively, to be strong.
Hmm.
And you want your glutes on your hips to be strong.
Hmm.
You should spend time training specifically, that is, the walking and or the running. But yes, having your lower body muscles strong is not going to fail you at all in any way. It can only help.
Yeah, and earlier in our recording today, you mentioned a different set of reps, maybe for when you're going for endurance.
Mhm.
And running is definitely an endurance sport, so I could see how particularly doing that could help with the endurance, even with running when you're not running, but you're still exercising. Does that make
Yes.
sense?
Yeah. So you can go in those higher rep ranges if you're training your calves, your hams, your quads, or your glutes directly. But
Yeah,
still, just getting out there and doing something will serve you well.
absolutely. All right. Anything else you want to add that you think we didn't cover in this discussion?
Um, I would just say those things that we mentioned to save time, like the rest pause, the supersets, and the
Mhm.
drop sets, those are probably not recommended for doing them when you're alone, or doing them with free weights, or doing them for strength in the low rep range because
Mhm.
your just increasing the likelihood for injury, especially if you're doing it alone. So, maybe save it for the higher rep ranges just to play it safely.
Yeah, absolutely. And remind everyone how they can connect with you if they want to work with you as a trainer or just more interested in your content that you put out.
Sure, thank you. Let's see, I'm on TikTok as JLFit, Facebook as JLFit. I'm on Instagram as j.l.fit.me. I've got a YouTube channel, Justin Lee, JLFit, and you can email me at Gmail, JLFITME, JLFitme@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you again for joining us and hope to talk to you again soon. Remember, everyone, it's not too late to sign up for the Give and Gobble. Go to gg5k.org and you can get more information about the race and sign up. Until next time, Justin and I both hope that you are happy and healthy and working on yourself. See you next time.
Thanks, Amanda. Bye, everybody.